I'm going to read a quote, a long quote, from Kenneth Whyte's publishing newsletter, Shush. You might have noticed that last month's federal budget introduced a whack of new cultural spending. The CBC got another $150 million. The Canada Music Fund took $48 million. Film and television raked in over $300 million. Books? Nothing. The budget's rationales for this new spending are to foster a sense of cultural identity and belonging in Canada, to sustain an informed citizenship, and to protect vulnerable industries. The unwritten context is the recent American assault on Canada's independence. You would think there would be room for books in this sort of budget. Is there anything more foundational to Canadian identity and an informed citizenry than books by Canadians and about Canada? Yet somehow our political leadership overlooked the literary sector. It's odd. The first thing our politicians do when they want to explain or advance their own careers is knock on a publisher's door. Granted, it's usually the door of an American publisher because the net result of our government's efforts to nurture the publishing sector in Canada over the past several decades has been to drive Canadian published books from more than 20% of those sold in Canada to less than 5%. We have the weakest domestic publishing industry in the developed world. Our prime ministers think nothing of taking their books to New York-based Penguin Random House or Simon & Schuster. Most of our most prominent fiction writers give all their North American rights to U.S. publishers instead of separating out Canadian rights and leaving them with a Canadian publisher. It's a travesty. I have a solution. In fact, I have many solutions. I have a whole book of solutions coming in January from Canadian public policy guru Richard Sturzberg, etc. So here's my solution du jour. Given that books are fundamental to any notion of Canadian identity, given that our domestic publishing sector is pathetically weak, given that any self-respecting country needs to be able to publish its own stories rather than rely on the branch plants of an increasingly difficult neighbor to do it for us, we arrange the following. We massively expand Canada's public lending right program, PLR. At present, the ridiculously underfunded PLR pays out about $15 million a year to some 20,000 authors whose books are circulated in Canada's public libraries. The distributions are based on a complicated formula that mostly notices how many libraries hold the author's book. It's capped at $4,500 an author, and most receive only a few $100s annually. We expand the PLR's spending envelope by a factor of 10, $150 million. Does that sound like a lot of money? It's not. It comes to about $375 per capita. That's about a tenth of what we spend annually on the CBC, which employs roughly the same number of people as book publishing. It's about a tenth of what we spend in direct funding and tax credits to film and television, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I agree with Whyte that, first of all, there is something rather off-putting about politicians, Chrétien, Carney, Harper, et cetera, publishing with U.S.-owned publishing houses. However, implicit in that kind of behavior is the understanding that those are the publishers that get books sold, those are the publishers that get titles into the most bookstores and so forth. This is a common complaint, incidentally, that Canadian-owned publishers have, that they sort of don't have enough access to bookshelf space in bookstores. So there is a problem there, a distribution problem, which helps explain why big-name politicians and big-name fiction writers go with U.S.-owned houses. At the same time, one needs to have a more honest discussion, really, about the titles that are published by Canadian-owned houses. Their lists have become very predictable. There are not really that many standout novels. That's the area that I know something about, or short story collections or poetry collections, that genuinely are able to compete with the best of what is published internationally, and this has become a problem. It's not simply a funding issue, it's a quality problem. And unless there's an honest discussion of the way what I call the selector class system in Canada works, we're going to end up with more titles that are focused very heavily on identity politics and sometimes publish work that just isn't as good as what is published internationally, and then expect audiences to come to it. If, as is the case, the number of titles that are published by Canadian houses once represented 20% of the market of books sold in Canada, and that percentage has fallen to 5%, one needs to ask about the choices that Canadian publishers make. They are notoriously fixated with identity politics, and that has meant turning a cold shoulder to certain kinds of genre writers, thrillers, spy novels, and that sort of thing, which is of interest to me. I mean, political thrillers, not these sort of scary war thrillers. There are no major social novels that are published these days. The excuse is always that we can't do that. We can't publish books that are, for example, 800 pages or 1,000 pages. It's a bogus excuse. Biblioasis a few years ago published a 1,000-page novel entitled Duck's Newburyport. The money is there to publish these doorstopper tomes when publishers sense that they might get those titles on the long lists of big international prizes like the Booker. Frankly, we need to have more long social novels set in Canada. I've written one. I finished it in 2012. Not a single person in the entire Canadian publishing industry has taken the trouble to even read that manuscript. There is something wrong, something just fundamentally wrong with the attitude of a lot of people working in Canadian publishing. Similarly, we need more war stories, especially World War II. For some bizarre reason, the Canadian publishing industry is fixated with World War I as a fictional topic. Nothing wrong with World War I, but bizarrely, what a lot of Canadians don't realize is that Canada didn't have any control over its foreign policy during World War I. We were still basically a quasi-colony of the UK. And we were in World War I whether we liked it or not. The conscription that the Canadian government imposed partway through the war was the real crisis, and that was the one area where the Canadian government had some latitude. World War II needs more novels.